Chapter 14, Section 1 of J.B. Bury's The Student's Roman Empire, Part 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Morgan Scorpion. The Student's Roman Empire, Part 1, by John Bagnall Bury. Chapter 14. The Principate of Gaius, Caligula, 37 to 41 A.D. Section 1. 1. Claims of Gaius to the Principate. He is accepted by the Senate. The acts of Tiberius are not confirmed. His will is annulled, and he is not deified. 2. Funeral of Tiberius. Reaction against his policy. Gaius shows respect for the Senate and piety to his family. 3. Munificence of Gaius. His speech in the Senate. 4. Early life and character of Gaius. He is under the influence of Agrippa. 5. Illness of Gaius. Sympathy of his subjects. Philo quoted. Death of Tiberius Gemellus. 6. Pleasures of Gaius. He degrades his dignity in the circus. 7. Sisters and wives of Gaius. His oriental ideas. He demands divine worship and professes to be a god. 8. His architectural extravagances. The bridge of ships at Puteoli. His jealousy of great names. 9. Financial difficulties drive him to plunder his subjects. 10. His expedition to Gaul. Conspiracy of Lentulus Getalicus. Exile of the Emperor's sisters. Acts of Gaius at Lugdunum. 11. Britannic expedition. His return to Rome. 12. The Reign of Terror. 13. Increased taxation, conspiracy of Caria, and murder of Gaius. 14. Policy of Gaius in the provinces reactionary. He restores client kingdoms in the east, but annexes the kingdom of Mauretania. 15. Refusal of the Jews to pay him divine worship. Embassies from Alexandria. Section 1. Popular beginnings of the reign of Gaius. We have seen that Tiberius had made Gaius and Gemellus co-partners in the inheritance of his private fortune, thus recommending them to the Senate and people as co-partners in the Principate. He seems to have intended for them a joint rule like that which Augustus intended for his grandchildren Gaius and Lucius Caesar. Perhaps he did not believe that such a rule was possible, but he left the decision to fate. The power and the initiative naturally devolved on Gaius, who was older than his cousin by 7 years and had already entered on public life. He was supported by the favour of the populace and the strength of the praetorians, with Macro at their head, so that his succession seemed certain. But it is to be observed that from a constitutional point of view, Gaius did not occupy as strong a position on the death of Tiberius as Tiberius had occupied on the death of Augustus. Tiberius had been already invested with the tribunician power, and the most important of the imperial prerogatives during the lifetime of Augustus. But since the death of his son Drusus, Tiberius had not moved the Senate to confer the tribunician power on anyone, and Sejanus, who had received proconsular power, no longer lived. Gaius was not in any sense a consors imperii. Hence on the death of Tiberius it was open to the Senate to elect as the new Princeps whomsoever they wished. But though the inheriting of the empire was not recognized by the constitution, it was generally felt that the heir of the emperor had the best claim to succeed him in the government as well as in his private property. Hence the election of Gaius was taken for granted both by himself and by others. The emperor's death was finally announced to the Senate in a letter from Gaius, conveyed by the hand of Macro, who also brought the testament of Tiberius in which Gaius and Gemellus were appointed co-heirs. Gaius asked the fathers to decree to the late emperor a public funeral, deification, and the other honours which had been decreed to Augustus, also to confirm his acts. But at the same time he demanded that the testament should be annulled. Such a document might prove inconvenient, for though legally it only concerned the private estate of Tiberius, it might be used to give his grandson a claim to participation in the imperial power. The senate accorded to the wishes of the candidate for the Empire, whom it did not hesitate to elect. The tribunician power and all the functions of the Empire were conferred on Gaius Caesar, March 18th. A public funeral, but not deification, was decreed to Tiberius, and his will was annulled. But in return some concessions were required from Gaius. He adopted his cousin Tiberius Gemellus and named him Princeps Inventutis, and he gave up his demand that the acts of his predecessor should be confirmed by the senate. Tiberius was not added to the gods, and in this way his memory was condemned. The accession of the young emperor was hailed by the people with wild delight as the beginning of a new age. They had received the news of the death of Tiberius with a savage outburst of hatred. It is said that they wished to drag his corpse to the river, and cried, "Tiberium in Tiberim," Tiberius to the Tiber. After years of fear, sullenness, and gloom, they looked forward to an age of merriment and pleasure, a return to the Augustan era. The procession conveying the body of the dead emperor was conducted by his successor from Misenum to Rome, and the people poured forth to meet it, forgetting their hatred of the dead tyrant in their joy at welcoming the new sovereign. They allowed the funeral solemnities to pass over quietly, and when Gaius had spoken a funeral oration, the corpse was cremated in the Campus Martius and the ashes placed in the mausoleum. The new reign was inaugurated by a reaction against the policy of the preceding. The most odious delators were banished from Italy, all prisoners were released, all exiles recalled. The extension of the law of maiestas to words written or spoken was done away with. The writings of the Cremutius Cordus and others, which had been suppressed, were permitted to circulate again, the emperor declaring that the writing and reading of history conduced to the interests of every good prince. Gaius also annulled the right of appeal to himself from the tribunals in Rome, Italy, and the senatorial provinces. He endeavoured to make a strict division between the functions of senate and princeps, and he followed the example of Augustus, neglected by Tiberius, in publishing the accounts of the state. He restored to the comitia the election of the magistrates, and thus showed that he desired to maintain the outward form of a republic. But this change was soon discovered to be useless, for as the number of candidates seldom exceeded the number of vacant places, there was no room for suffrage, and the comitia, when it assembled, found that it had nothing to do. Hence after 2 years the system of Tiberius was restored. Gaius assisted the administration of justice by creating a 5th decuria of jurymen, for the existing number was found to be unequal to the work they had to do. It was composed of men of the same qualification as those who filled the 4th decuria, created by Augustus. Gaius also conferred the equus publicus on a large number of persons, because the equestrian order had been greatly reduced in number in the reign of Tiberius, who had neglected to replenish it by new nominations. The son of Germanicus distinguished himself by piety to his family no less than by respect to the senate. When he had appeared in the presence of the fathers, and won their good will by a plausible and submissive speech, he hurried in person to the islands where his mother and brother had been banished, and conveyed their ashes back to Rome, to be deposited in the mausoleum of the Caesars. He caused the senate to decree to his grandmother Astonia the titles and honours which had been formerly decreed to Livia. He changed the name of the month September to Germanicus, so that the name of his father might rank in the calendar beside Julius and Augustus. He called upon his uncle Tiberius Claudius, whose existence no one ever seemed to remember, and who hitherto, although he was 46 years of age, held only equestrian rank, to be his colleague in the consulship, on which he entered on July 1st, 37 A.D. His sisters Julia Livilla, Agrippina, and Drusilla received the honours of Vestal Virgins. Gaius himself modestly refused the title Pater Patriae, which the senate offered him. How popular the new reign was with the multitude is shown by the immense number of victims, 160,000, which were offered in thanksgiving to the gods. The citizens and the soldiers were delighted with the unbounded munificence of the successor of the frugal Tiberius. All the legacies and donations ordered in the will of Tiberius were paid, although that deed was otherwise annulled, and the testament of Livia, which Tiberius had neglected, was now executed. Besides this, Gaius distributed to the plebs the donation which should have been given when he assumed the toga virilis. The immense sum which lay in his treasury heaped together by the saving policy of Tiberius, enabled him to defray these expenses and to enter upon a course of reckless profusion, which the rabble greeted with applause. At the same time he reduced his revenue by abolishing the small tax of half per cent, on sales in Italy. When Gaius assumed the consulship, he made a speech to the senate, criticising severely the acts of Tiberius and making fair promises for his own future government. The fathers were so pleased, and yet were so afraid that he would alter his views, that they decreed that his speech should be read aloud every year. His exemplary devotion to his duties during the 2 following months seemed to augur well for the future. But on the last day of August, which was his birthday, he threw aside business and gave a magnificent entertainment, such as had not been witnessed for many years. On this occasion he consecrated the temple of Augustus, which was at length completed. From this time Gaius showed the world a new side of his character, which few perhaps had suspected. He plunged into a mad course of shameless dissipation and extravagance. When his subjects saluted their new emperor, they were quite ignorant what manner of man he was. In his personal appearance there was nothing to attract. His figure was ill proportioned, his eyes set deep in his head, his features pale, and his scowling expression still displeases us in his bust. His constitution was weak, and his intellectual capacity was small, and whatever intellect he possessed had never been trained except in rhetorical exercise. Want of training in his youth may partly account for the vagaries of his manhood, but there is no doubt that his brain was affected. He was subject to epileptic fits, and he suffered from sleeplessness. His early childhood was spent in a camp on the Rhine. His next experience was the distressing circumstances of his father's death. Afterwards he was detained under the watchful eye of Tiberius in the lonely island, where he learned to dissemble, flatter, and deceive. It is said that Tiberius penetrated the real character of the crafty boy, and made the remark that Gaius lived for the perdition of himself and all men. All the tastes of this degenerate grandson of Drusus were vulgar and vile. He cared only for the company of gladiators and dancers. He took delight in the sight of torture and death. He seems to have been always thoroughly unsound in mind, and when the unlimited power of the sovereign of the Roman Empire was placed in his hands, his head was completely turned. He had fallen under the influence of Herod Agrippa, who instilled into his mind Oriental ideas as to the divine nature of monarchy, and filled his head with dreams of the grandeur of Eastern kings. This Agrippa, son of Aristobulus, was grandson of Herod the Great, and had come to Rome along with his mother Berenice and his sister Herodias after the death of his father. Rome was at that time an asylum for the members of Eastern royal families, who in their own country would probably have perished by the hand of their reigning kinsman. Antonia, whose father had been a friend of Herod, became the protectress of his grandson, and the young Agrippa was brought up in the company of Claudius, who was of his own age. When his uncle Herod Antipas, the Herod of the Gospels, B.C. 4 to A.D. 39, who married Herodias, obtained the kingdom of Samaria, Agrippa was invested with the governorship of the city of Tiberias. But this did not satisfy his ambition. He returned to Rome in the last years of Tiberius to watch for an opportunity to better his position. He attached himself to the young Gaius, whose prospects seemed to be bright, and obtained a great influence over him. Agrippa was a shrewd and energetic man, who had seen a great deal of the world, very dissipated and unprincipled, and always in want of money. His descriptions of Oriental magnificence, his pictures of the omnipotence which even the smallest monarchs in the East possessed, over the life and property of their subjects, his lessons perhaps in the voluptuousness of Asia, produced a deep and dangerous effect on the diseased mind and sensual nature of the future emperor. Rome had been threatened with the introduction of Oriental theories by Antonius. She was destined to experience them at the caprice of his great-grandson. After the celebration of his birthday, the emperor did not resume his political duties, but gave himself up to dissipation and enjoyment, and from this time to the end of his reign his only occupation was the pursuit of pleasure and excitement. Under the first wild outburst of sensuality his weak constitution gave way and he became dangerously ill. The general distress which was then felt both in Rome and in the provinces show how popular he was. Philo, a Jew of Alexandria, describes the prosperity of the empire at the beginning of his reign, and the sympathy which was felt at his illness. The passage deserves to be quoted. Who was not amazed and delighted at beholding Gaius assume the government of the empire, tranquil and well ordered as it was, fitted and compact in all its parts, north and south, east and west, Greek and barbarian, soldier and civilian, all combined together in the enjoyment of a common peace and prosperity. It abounded everywhere in accumulated treasures of gold and silver, coin and plate. It boasted a vast force of both horse and foot, by land and by sea, and its resources flowed, as it were, from a perennial fountain. Nothing was to be seen throughout our cities but altars and sacrifices, priests clad in white and garlanded, the joyous ministers of the general mirth, festivals and assemblies, musical contests and horse races, nocturnal revels, amusements, recreations, pleasures of every kind and addressed to every sense. The rich no longer lorded it over the poor, the strong upon the weak, masters upon servants, or creditors on their debtors. The distinction of classes were levelled by the occasion, so that the Saturnian age of the poets might no longer be regarded as a fiction, so nearly was it revived in the life of that happy era. The provinces were happy for 7 months. Then the news arrived that the emperor, having abandoned himself to sensuality, had fallen grievously sick, and was in great danger. When the sad news was spread among the nations, every government was at once cast aside, every city and house was clouded with sorrow and dejection in proportion to its recent hilarity. All parts of the world sickened with Gaius, and were more sick than he, for his was the sickness of the body only, theirs of the soul. All men reflected on the evils of anarchy, its wars, famines, and devastations, from which they foresaw no protection but in the emperor's recovery. But as soon as the disease began to abate, the rumour swiftly reached every corner of the empire, and universal were the excitement and anxiety to hear it from day to day confirmed. The safety of the prince was regarded by every land and island as identical with its own. Nor was a single country ever so interested before in the health of any one man as the whole world then was in the health of Gaius. This instructive passage of an Alexandrine writer of that day shows how important an emperor's life was then felt to be for the welfare of the state. Gaius recovered, but he did not mend his ways. The solicitude of the citizens and the provincials impressed him with a deeper sense than ever of his own importance. His first act was to remove from his path his cousin Gemellus, who had a rival claim to the throne. About November 37 A.D., the feeble grandson of Tiberius was compelled to kill himself. As he is called the son of Drusus, his adoption by Gaius was apparently annulled on his death. Macro the praetorian prefect had laid Gaius under such great obligations in helping him to secure the throne, that he ventured on the indiscretion of sometimes reminding the emperor of his duties. At the same time Ennia pressed her lover to keep his promise of marrying her. But Gaius was weary of the wife and impatient of the husband, and he resolved to destroy them both. Macro received a command to put himself to death. About the same time Gaius recalled M. Silanus, the father of his first wife, who was then proconsul of Africa, and caused him to be executed. These acts may be regarded as the turning point of his reign. End of Chapter 14, Section 1.